what emerged was the Anglo-American financial empire. In other words, we decided that we would create a system that would reward people for cooperating with us and giving us advantageous arrangements for trade, provided they used our dollar and slipped into this new Bretton Woods style financial system that effectively subordinated everybody's interest to our interest. Now, remember that for most people at the end of the Second World War, who were in poverty, who were in ruins, frankly, or were very, very behind in terms of economic development, it made sense to cooperate with us. But over time, this financial system has been employed as a means of bullying countries into submission. And we need to understand something. When we mention the dollar, we're talking about effectively a network where you use the dollar, you go through the SWIFT system, you settle all your accounts and debts with a dollar. And of course, you enter into what effectively is what we accuse the Chinese of, which is debt slavery. We accuse them of debt slavery. We're the ones that have been enslaving the world with debt through this dollar network. How do you get out from under the dollar network? Well, first of all, you end up with gold as a reserve currency, which is, as Nassim Taleb points out, is increasingly a fact. And then secondly, you stop using dollars to the extent that you're able. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to go to another system. What's the other system? BRICS. And they have this thing that the Chinese have helped develop called CIPS, which is the alternative to the SWIFT system, which is very modern, digital, and settles business across national lines. Why is all of this significant? Well, people are frankly sick of us because as time wore on, we weren't satisfied to bully people with financial means. We decided that we'd threaten them militarily if they did not do what we wanted. In other words, you own assets in a place like Senegal that has gold mines and produces 20% of its economy produces gold. And let us say that Senegal is in debt to the United States, to France, to Britain, to the Western financial system, and has been using dollars. And suddenly the people in Senegal said, well, we'll never get out from underneath this terrible debt that has been inflicted on us. They turn then to BRICS. And what does BRICS say? Forget that debt. Nationalize your assets, join us, and you can tell the West to fly a kite. Well, that's effectively where we're headed right now. In other words, the alternative network, the alternative to the dollar network, to the financial system we built, is emerging. It's emerging very quickly. It's far stronger, far more resilient, more modern in the case of CIPS, for instance, than SWIFT. And it's come online long before anybody thought it was possible. If you had told people 10 years ago that within 10 years, an alternative to the dollar-denominated financial system run by the United States and the Anglo-American financial empire would come along that quickly, everybody would say, well, that's impossible. These things take decades to build. Well, it's turned out that it's there. It's very real. So de-dollarization now is ongoing. So if you look at Iran and China, for instance, they do all of their business in their own currency. End of discussion. That is going to become the standard around the world. The map that you showed is very important because it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, gosh, that's most of the world.
Yeah.
That's most of the world's population. And you talked about 45% of global GDP. Well, where are we in terms of global GDP? We've fallen below 23%. You know, the time after World War II, we constitute almost 50% of it. The old order is dying.
Well, yeah, and in fact, that was one thing that Putin also this past weekend pointed out. And you talked about messages that maybe Putin was subtly sending. This one would seem a little bit more direct.
The combined GDP in purchasing power parity has already reached $77 trillion. That's according to IMF data for 2025. By the way, BRICS significantly outperform some other associations, including the Group of Seven. They have $57 trillion.
So he's saying, look, we're already outperforming as a bloc the G7. And of course, we've always viewed the G7 as the sine qua non of the global world, economic order. And